Dear viewers, prepare yourselves for a gripping tale that will pull you into the depths of mystery and suspense. Tonight, exclusively on the Curious Case channel, we unravel a chilling story narrated by Dr. Rami, one that will keep you at the edge of your seat. The Midnight Shadow is an original thriller that captures the allure and danger of a bygone era, an age where secrets lurked in the dimly lit corridors of grand hotels, and deception traveled faster than the steam engines of luxury trains. Set against the opulent backdrop of the 1930s, this tale explores the intricate web of human psychology, where greed, betrayal, and ambition intertwine in deadly fashion. With every turn of the page, misdirection reigns supreme, making you question everything you think you know. As the story unfolds, prepare for an unexpected twist, because in the world of crime and deception nothing is ever what it seems. So sit back, immerse yourself in the unknown, and let the mystery begin. The porter, his pocket now heavier with a generous tip, stepped away as the train doors slammed shut. A commanding voice echoed down the platform, "Midnight Express, non-stop to Blackwood Manor. Final call." A piercing whistle cut through the cold night air, and the train lurched forward, wheels screeching against the tracks as it disappeared into the mist. Seated alone in a dimly lit first-class carriage, Lieutenant James Carver adjusted his coat against the December chill and pulled the window shut. But just as he settled in, a peculiar scent drifted through the air, sharp, chemical, unnerving. It clawed at his memory, dragging him back to the sterile corridors of a wartime hospital. Chloroform. The realization sent a ripple of unease down his spine. Frowning, he cracked the window open again, shifting to a seat facing the engine. With a sigh, he pulled out his pipe, striking a match with fingers that trembled slightly, then took a long drag. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels was almost soothing, until he reached for his suitcase. He bent down, intending to slide it beneath the opposite seat, but it wouldn't budge. Something was blocking it. With growing irritation, he shoved harder, but the suitcase still jutted out awkwardly. "What the hell?" Muttering under his breath, he yanked it back and crouched to see what was in the way. The moment his eyes adjusted to the shadowed space, his breath caught in his throat. A pale, motionless hand protruded from the darkness, fingers curled as if frozen in a final plea for help. Before he could react, the train jolted violently, and a sharp, guttural cry escaped his lips, swallowed instantly by the roar of the wind outside. Somewhere down the corridor, a bell clanged frantically as the emergency brake was pulled. With a screech of metal and a burst of steam, the Midnight Express came to a grinding, unwilling halt. I picked up the folded note that had been flicked across the table toward me. It was short, almost unnervingly so. "Dear Sir, I request your immediate presence at Blackwood House. It is a matter of utmost urgency. Yours faithfully, Edgar Blackwell." I frowned, my mind searching for a connection that refused to surface. Setting the note down, I turned toward Inspector Graves, who sat across from me, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he unfolded the evening newspaper, and in a slow, deliberate voice, began to read aloud. "A shocking discovery was made late last night, aboard the Midnight Express. A young officer returning from duty stumbled upon a gruesome crime. Under the seat of his first-class compartment, he discovered the lifeless body of a woman, stabbed through the heart. Upon the horrifying realization, the officer immediately pulled the emergency cord, bringing the train to a screeching halt in the dead of night. The victim, a woman of apparent high status, was elegantly dressed, though no form of identification was found on her person. Authorities remain baffled." The inspector paused, his eyes meeting mine, gauging my reaction before continuing. "An update from Scotland Yard confirms that the victim has now been identified as Lady Eleanor Blackwell, wife of the late industrial magnate Charles Blackwell." A cold silence settled over the room, and then Graves leaned in, his voice lower, almost conspiratorial. "Still don't see the connection," he murmured. "Let me spell it out for you. Before she became Lady Blackwell, she was Eleanor Sutton, daughter of Edgar Blackwell, the same man who has summoned you tonight." The weight of his words sank in, a slow creeping dread curling around my thoughts. This was no ordinary crime. This was a puzzle, a web of secrets, deceit, and betrayal, and I had just been invited to step straight into its heart. Halliday, the ruthless steel magnate of America, a man whose fortune was as impenetrable as the iron walls of his empire, and now he had summoned me. I leaned back, my fingers absently tapping against the edge of the letter. Interesting. Inspector Graves studied me with a knowing smirk. You've crossed paths before, haven't you? I nodded. Years ago, a delicate matter involving stolen bearer bonds, and a web of deceit that nearly cost him a fortune. He owed me then. Seems he remembers. Graves exhaled slowly, then chuckled. I suppose you also remember his daughter. The name surfaced from memory like a half-forgotten melody. Eleanor Halliday, the darling of American high society, beautiful, headstrong, and naive enough to believe she could escape the gilded cage her father had built for her. She had always attracted trouble. A love affair, wasn't it? I mused aloud. A certain Count Laurent, a smooth-talking aristocrat with a taste for wealthy women. Halliday got wind of it, and yanked her back to America before it became a scandal. And yet, Graves interjected, trouble found her again. I sighed. She married, didn't she? Graves nodded. The Honorable Julian Ashford, charming, well-bred, and as unscrupulous as they come. He squandered his inheritance on the racetrack before her father's fortune saved him. But, as these things go, the marriage was doomed from the start. He never wanted her, only her money. I frowned. They separated. Legally? Not yet. But from what I hear, it was only a matter of time. Halliday made sure his daughter's fortune was locked away behind ironclad contracts. Ashford was desperate. Graves paused, then leaned in slightly. Desperate men do dangerous things. A heavy silence settled between us. You're wondering, aren't you? Graves finally said. I met his gaze. I'm wondering just how far a man would go when the only thing standing between him and ruin is the woman he swore to love. Outside, the rain pattered against the window, a soft rhythmic tapping, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. I stood, slipping the letter into my coat pocket. Time to pay Halliday a visit. I assume you'll accompany me to see Mr. Halliday? Graves asked, already shrugging into his coat. I nodded. I wouldn't miss it. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time we stepped onto the pavement. The streets of London gleamed under the gaslights, the damp cobblestones reflecting the flickering glow. A few minutes in a rattling cab brought us to an imposing townhouse in Park Lane, a monument to American wealth and unrelenting ambition. The butler, a gaunt, severe-looking man, admitted us without a word. He led us through an opulent corridor, lined with oil paintings and heavy oak furniture before ushering us into a vast library. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, the air thick with the scent of burning wood from a grand fireplace that cast long shadows against the mahogany walls. The door had barely closed behind us when a figure strode in. Mr. Edgar Halliday was a formidable presence, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with the piercing gaze of a man who had spent his life bending others to his will. His aggressive jaw jutted forward as if challenging the world itself. A man used to control, now faced with something beyond his grasp. Mr. Halliday, I greeted. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. I figure you know why I called you here, he said gruffly, his American drawl sharp and clipped. You've read the papers. I don't sit on my hands when there's work to be done. He stabbed a thick finger toward me. I remember the job you did with those bearer bonds, and I never forget a name. Scotland Yard's on this, but I want my own man too. Money's no object. Every dollar I made was for my little girl, and now, he paused, his throat working as if swallowing back something unspeakable. Then, with renewed force, he spat out, I'll spend my last cent to catch the damn scoundrel that did this. You hear me? I don't care what it costs. I want justice. The raw intensity in his voice left no doubt. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about power, the power to set the world right again. I inclined my head. I accept, Mr. Halliday. I saw your daughter in Paris several times, and now I'll see that justice is done. But first I need details. Start from the beginning. Her journey to Plymouth, any unusual circumstances, anyone she feared, anything that stood out. Halliday exhaled sharply, running a heavy hand over his face before sinking into a leather armchair. To begin with, he said, his voice lower now, edged with something rawer than anger. She wasn't supposed to go to Plymouth at all. She told me she'd be staying in London for the week. Then out of nowhere she wires me from the train station, just a single line, traveling to Plymouth. Urgent matter. Will explain soon. That was the last I heard from her. He gritted his teeth, his fists clenching. She was running from something, or someone. I should have known, should have stopped her. Did she mention anything unusual in the past few weeks? I pressed. He hesitated, then nodded. There were signs. Eleanor was troubled. She tried to hide it, but I know my girl. She stopped attending parties, stopped seeing friends, and then he exhaled heavily. She came to me a week ago and asked about changing the terms of her inheritance, said she needed access to more funds. When I refused, she got angry. Desperate, I exchanged a glance with Graves. And her husband? I asked. Holliday's expression darkened. Julian Ashford is a leech, a parasite. I warned her about him before they married, but she wouldn't listen. He lived off her money, gambled it away, and when she cut him off, he started showing up at her house, uninvited, making demands. Was there any talk of a divorce? More than talk, Holliday muttered. Eleanor was done with him. She had her lawyers draw up the papers, but she hadn't signed yet. And now, he stopped, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. Now she never will. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. I leaned forward. One last thing, Mr. Holliday. Do you know if she was meeting someone in Plymouth? Holliday's brows furrowed. I don't know, but whatever it was urgent enough to get her on that train, and it cost her her life. I stood, my mind already turning over the possibilities. Then that's where we start. Graves followed suit, his eyes sharp with intrigue. As we left the house, stepping into the damp London night, one thing was certain. Eleanor Holliday had uncovered something dangerous, and someone had made sure she wouldn't live to reveal it. Now it was our turn to uncover the truth. She wasn't going to Plymouth. Holliday's voice was tight, controlled, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. I exchanged a glance with Graves. Our interest sharpened. Where was she going then? I asked. She was supposed to be attending a house party at Avamere Court, the Duchess of Swansea's estate. He exhaled sharply, as if forcing himself to speak the words aloud. She left London on the 12:14 from Paddington, bound for Bristol. That train doesn't even go near Plymouth. The express makes a non-stop run to Bristol, before continuing through Weston, Taunton, Exeter and Newton Abbot. That was the route. That was the plan. And she travelled alone. Yes. Her carriage was reserved as far as Bristol, first class, private. Her maid, Jane Mason, travelled separately in a third-class compartment in the next coach. Graves leaned forward. What kind of party was this at Avamere Court? Holliday ran a hand over his face. A lively one. Several balls, dinners, all high society. My daughter had nearly all her jewels with her valuable pieces, some inherited, others gifts from me, in total worth about $100,000. I stilled. That was a fortune in gemstones, enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. Who had charge of the jewels? Graves asked. She did. Holliday's gaze was sharp. Eleanor never trusted anyone with them. She carried them herself in a small blue Morocco case, never let it out of her sight. A thread of unease coiled in my mind. A woman traveling alone with that kind of wealth. Was it a robbery gone wrong, or was something deeper at play? What happened when she reached Bristol? I pressed. Holliday hesitated, then continued. At Bristol, Jane Mason, her maid, collected my daughter's dressing bag and wraps, and went to meet her at the carriage door. She expected Eleanor to disembark, but she didn't, I guessed. Holliday's jaw tightened. No. Instead, she told Mason that she was not getting off at Bristol, that she was continuing on. She instructed the maid to place her luggage in the station's cloakroom, have some tea in the refreshment hall, and wait for her return on an afternoon train back to London. A pause settled in the room. I could practically hear the crackling of the fireplace, the shifting of shadows against the heavy oak paneling. She lied, I said softly. Holliday's gaze snapped to mine. Yes. Did she say why? No. And the maid, what was her reaction? Mason was astonished, but she obeyed. She assumed Eleanor had a private reason for the change in plans. My daughter was independent, strong-willed. If she said she was going on, no one questioned it. I tapped my fingers against the armrest, my mind working through the possibilities. Did anyone see her speaking to someone before she boarded the train? Halliday frowned. Not that I know of, but someone had to be waiting for her beyond Bristol. She wouldn't have changed her plans for no reason. Something or someone made her stay on that train. Graves spoke, his voice thoughtful. And the jewels? Were they found with her? Halliday's expression darkened. No, the Morocco case was missing. A silence stretched between us. This wasn't just a murder, it was a deliberate act, carefully orchestrated. Eleanor Halliday had boarded a train to Bristol, intending to go to a grand house party. Somewhere along the way, she changed her mind, or was forced to, and by the time that train reached Plymouth, she was dead. The question wasn't just who killed her, it was why, and whoever held the answer was still out there, waiting, watching. She did as she was told, Halliday continued, his voice edged with something I couldn't quite place, anger, grief, or perhaps both. She placed the luggage in the cloakroom, had some tea and waited. Train after train arrived, each one bringing new passengers, but my daughter never appeared. I leaned forward, absorbing every word. She waited through the evening, watching the arrivals, expecting Eleanor to step off one of those trains, but she never did. After the last train of the night pulled in and emptied its passengers, the station grew quiet. The maid, confused and increasingly uneasy, had no choice but to leave the luggage where it was and take a room at a nearby hotel. Halliday's hands clenched into fists, and then this morning, she read the news that would change everything. He swallowed hard before continuing. She saw the headlines, saw my daughter's name, and realized that while she had been waiting in Bristol, Eleanor had been murdered in a train bound for Plymouth. A cold silence fell between us. Graves cleared his throat. Sir, is there anything at all to explain why your daughter suddenly changed her plans? Halliday hesitated. Then his voice quieter, he said, there is one thing. I leaned in closer. Go on. According to Jane Mason, when she reached my daughter's carriage at Bristol, Eleanor was no longer alone. There was a man with her. Graves and I exchanged sharp glances. A man, I repeated. Who? Halliday exhaled through his nose, frustration evident. Jane Mason didn't see his face. He was standing at the far window, deliberately looking away. He was there, and when Eleanor told Jane she wasn't getting off, she was standing in the corridor, the platform side. I processed this carefully, and the train was a corridor one, correct? Halliday nodded. Yes. It had an aisle running along one side. Graves drummed his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. And which side was the corridor on? The platform side, Halliday confirmed. Eleanor stood in the corridor while speaking to her maid. Whoever that man was, he remained in the compartment facing away. Something twisted in my gut. You're certain that her unexpected meeting with this man is what made her change her plans? Halliday's mouth was a grim line. It's the only explanation that makes sense. I took a slow breath. And you have no idea who he might have been? The millionaire hesitated. I caught the brief flicker of something in his eyes, uncertainty, or perhaps a secret he wasn't ready to reveal. Then finally he shook his head. No, I do not know at all. A lie? Perhaps, but whether Halliday was protecting someone or truly in the dark, I wasn't sure. What I did know was this. Eleanor Halliday had met someone in that carriage, and whatever was said between them was enough to change her plans, enough to ensure that by the time that train reached Plymouth, she was dead, and the man who had stood with his back to the window, the man whose face had gone unseen, was the key to everything. Now as for the discovery of the body, Halliday's voice dropped, the weight of grief and fury pressing down on him. He took a breath before continuing. It was a young naval officer who found her. He was walking through the train when he reached her compartment. The door was slightly ajar, swaying with the movement of the carriage. At first he thought she was simply asleep, slumped unnaturally in her seat, but then Halliday's voice caught, just for a second. Then he saw the blood. I listened intently, every detail painting a clearer picture of the horror that had unfolded. He raised the alarm immediately. Fortunately, there was a doctor aboard. He examined her. Halliday clenched his fists, knuckles whitening. She had been chloroformed first, rendered unconscious, and then he exhaled sharply. Stabbed. I exchanged a look with Graves. How long had she been dead? I asked. The doctor estimated around 4 hours, which means it must have happened not long after the train left Bristol, probably between there and Weston, maybe even between Weston and Taunton. The train had continued its journey, passengers unaware that death had already taken a seat among them. And the jewel case? I prompted. Halliday's jaw tightened. Gone. Just gone. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after. There was silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had to be asked. Your daughter's fortune, who does it pass to? Halliday hesitated. Then finally he spoke. Flossie made a will shortly after her marriage. Everything goes to her husband. A heavy pause followed, thick with unspoken suspicions. But he continued. I may as well tell you outright, monsieur, that I consider my son-in-law an unprincipled scoundrel. There was venom in his words now. I never trusted him. My daughter was about to free herself from him. Finally, I had been advising her for months, and at last she agreed. My lawyers were already preparing the proceedings. I steepled my fingers, absorbing this information. So he was about to lose his access to her wealth. Not that he ever had access. Halliday corrected. I made sure of that. I settled her money in such a way that he couldn't touch a cent of it during her lifetime. And yet he still managed to get money out of her. Graves interjected. Halliday let out a slow, bitter sigh. Yes, Flossie was soft-hearted. Despite their separation, she gave in to his demands rather than risk the scandal of a public dispute. He bled her dry whenever he could. But this time I put my foot down. There would be no more handouts. And where is Mr. Carrington now? I asked. In town, Halliday replied. He was in the countryside yesterday, but he returned last night. I tapped my fingers against the polished wood of Halliday's desk, my mind racing. A desperate, money-hungry husband, a wife about to sever all ties, a fortune hanging in the balance, and now a train, a missing jewel case, and a body left to be discovered by a stranger. I took a deep breath. I believe that is all for now, Monsieur Halliday. Then standing, I straightened the inkstand on the desk with careful precision. But I would very much like to speak to the maid. Halliday pressed the bell with a firm hand, his face set in grim determination. A moment later, the heavy oak door swung open, and a footman appeared. Send in Jane Mason, Halliday ordered, his voice clipped. The servant disappeared, and within moments, a woman stepped inside, rigid-backed, her expression impassive, the face of a woman who had served too long to let tragedy shake her resolve. Jane Mason was as hard-featured as they came, the kind of servant who knew her place and rarely overstepped. But there was something in the stiffness of her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, that suggested she had seen more than she let on. I inclined my head slightly. Miss Mason, you will permit me a few questions. Of course, sir. Your mistress, was she in her usual spirits before leaving yesterday morning? Not anxious, not flustered? Oh no, sir, Jane answered promptly. She was quite herself, calm and collected, but at Bristol she changed completely, like a different woman, sir. She was upset, nervous, not making sense, almost as if she was afraid. I exchanged a look with Graves before turning back to her. Tell me exactly what she said. Jane's brow furrowed slightly as she recalled the moment. Well, sir, as near as I remember, she said, Mason, I've got to alter my plans. Something has happened. I'm not getting out here after all. I must go on, get out the luggage, and put it in the cloakroom, then have some tea and wait for me in the station. She hesitated before adding, I was surprised, sir. It wasn't like her. Wait for you here, ma'am? I asked, and she said, yes, yes, don't leave the station. I shall return by a later train. I don't know when. It may be quite late. Jane paused, pressing her lips together in a thin line. It wasn't my place to ask questions, sir. But I thought it very strange. Strange how? It was unlike her, sir. She was always so sure of herself, always so clear in her plans. But this, Jane's voice dropped slightly. It was as if she wasn't sure at all, as if she was looking to someone else to tell her what to do. A chill ran down my spine. Someone else? You mean the gentleman in the carriage? Jane nodded slowly. Yes, sir. She didn't speak to him, but she turned around once or twice, like she was seeking reassurance, like she was asking him if she was making the right decision. I leaned forward slightly. And you never saw his face? No, sir. He stood with his back to me the whole time. But you must have noticed something. His build, his clothing. Jane frowned, as if replaying the memory in her mind. He had on a light-colored overcoat and a traveling cap. He was tall and slender-like. The back of his head was dark. I let a moment of silence stretch between us before asking the next question. And you are certain you did not recognize him? A flicker of something, hesitation, crossed her face. Oh no, sir. I don't think so. You don't think so? I pressed. Jane swallowed. Well, sir, it was about the master's build. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Mr. Carrington's build, Graves asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Jane hesitated again. Yes, sir, but I cannot say for sure. Halliday's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. A shadow of suspicion had begun to form, dark, twisting, and unmistakable. The pieces were coming together, and I did not like the picture they painted. Jane Mason hesitated, her hands tightening around the folds of her apron. I never thought it could be him, sir. We so rarely saw him, and I wouldn't dare say for certain, but I can't say it wasn't him either. Poor bent down, plucking a stray pin from the carpet with meticulous care, his expression unreadable as he examined it. Then in a voice as steady as a blade, he asked, would it have been possible for this man, whoever he was, to have entered the train at Bristol before you reached the carriage? Jane considered this, her brow furrowing. Yes, sir, I think it would. The train was quite full, and my compartment was terribly crowded. It took me several minutes to gather my things and step out. And then she hesitated. There was the crowd, sir, a very large crowd on the platform, people pushing and moving about. That delayed me as well. She exhaled slowly, as if the memory weighed upon her. But even so, sir, he'd only have had a minute or two to speak with the mistress if that were the case. That's why I assumed he must have come along the corridor instead. Poor nodded slightly, his gaze sharp. That does seem the more likely possibility, he murmured. A moment of silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then he straightened, his voice taking on an edge of precision. You know, of course, how your mistress was dressed. Jane gave a quick, respectful nod. Yes, sir. The newspapers mentioned some details, but I can confirm. She was wearing a white fox fur stole, a white spotted veil, and a blue frieze coat and skirt, the shade they call electric blue. Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. Striking, he remarked almost to himself. Mr. Halliday, who had remained silent until now, exhaled sharply. The inspector believes that outfit will help us pinpoint where the crime occurred. Anyone who saw her would remember her. Jane remained still, her expression unreadable, but something about the way her hands were twisting against her apron suggested discomfort. She knew more. Paul's sharp eyes didn't miss it. That will be all, Miss Mason. Thank you. The maid gave a stiff nod and turned, disappearing through the door. As soon as it clicked shut, Paul rose with an air of finality, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. That is all I can do here, he said briskly. Except, Mr. Halliday, I must ask you again to tell me everything, absolutely everything. Halliday's jaw tightened. I already have. A pause. Then Paul nodded, but his gaze remained sharp, almost too knowing. Then he said softly, there is nothing more to be said, but the weight in his voice suggested otherwise, and in the lingering silence, the unspoken truth hung thick in the air. There was more to this than anyone was willing to admit. Paul's expression was unreadable, as he leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in deep contemplation. Then with the precision of a blade, he uttered the words that made Halliday stiffen. I must decline the case. A heavy silence settled over the room. Halliday blinked, confusion flashing across his face before giving way to frustration. What? But why? Paul's gaze remained unwavering. Because you have not been frank with me. I assure you I've told you everything. No, Paul interrupted, his voice calm yet razor-sharp. You are keeping something back. For a moment the only sound was the distant ticking of the mantel clock. Then with a resigned sigh, Halliday reached into his pocket, withdrew a folded sheet of paper, and placed it on the table. I suppose this is what you're after, Monsieur Poor, he said gruffly, though how you knew about it, I can't fathom. A knowing smile played on Poor's lips as he unfolded the letter. The paper was delicate, the ink faded in places, yet the slanted handwriting was still clear. Without hesitation he read aloud, "Chère Madame, it is with infinite pleasure that I anticipate the joy of seeing you again. Your most amiable reply to my last letter fills me with impatience. I have never forgotten those days in Paris, and it is cruel that you should be leaving London tomorrow. However, before long, perhaps much sooner than you expect, I shall have the honor of gazing once more upon the lady who has ever reigned supreme in my heart. Believe, chère Madame, in the assurances of my most devoted and unalterable sentiments, Armand de Leroux." The name hung in the air like an unspoken curse. Halliday's face darkened. "I take it, Monsieur Poor, you were unaware that my daughter intended to renew her acquaintance with Count de Leroux." Poor handed the letter back with a polite bow. "I suspected, but I did not know, not until now." Halliday let out a bitter laugh. "It was a thunderbolt to me as well. I found this letter in my daughter's handbag. As you may be aware, this so-called Count is an adventurer of the worst kind." Poor inclined his head slightly. "Indeed." Then Halliday's gaze sharpened. "What I want to know, Monsieur Poor, is how you knew about the existence of this letter in the first place." Poor smiled, a quiet enigmatic expression that sent a chill through the room. "Ah, Monsieur Halliday, I did not." Halliday's brow furrowed. "Then how?" Poor interlaced his fingers, his voice smooth yet laced with a subtle intensity. "Because to track footprints and recognize cigarette ash is not enough for a detective. A true investigator must also be a master of psychology, and I know this." He leaned forward, his words cutting through the air like a scalpel. "You despised your son-in-law, you mistrusted him. He benefits from your daughter's death." Halliday remained silent, his grip tightening on the arms of his chair. Poor continued, his tone softer but no less piercing. "The maid's description of the mysterious man on the train, his build, his presence, it all leads to a singular conclusion. But now with this letter," he tapped the paper lightly, "a new thread emerges, a lover from the past, a rekindled acquaintance, a secret meeting that was never meant to be discovered." His voice dropped to a whisper, though the words carried the weight of certainty. "Now tell me, Monsieur Halliday, was your daughter truly running from one danger, only to fall into the hands of another?" The question hung in the air like a noose, tightening with each passing second. Poor's sharp gaze settled on Halliday, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface of the desk. "The man bears a sufficient resemblance to him, yes, yet you hesitate to follow that track. Why?" Halliday hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Because my suspicions lie elsewhere." Poor nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then you were keeping something back." Halliday clenched his jaw before giving a reluctant nod. "You're right, Monsieur Poor. I was certain of Rupert's guilt, until I found this letter. It has unsettled me, horribly." Poor unfolded the letter once more, his keen eyes scanning the words as though they held a coded message only he could decipher. "Before very long, and perhaps sooner than you think," he murmured. His gaze flicked up. "Clearly the Count had no intention of waiting. He anticipated meeting your daughter in secrecy before you even had the chance to suspect his presence." A chill crept into Halliday's expression. "Are you suggesting? Was it he who traveled down from London by the 12:14 train?" Poor interrupted smoothly. "Did he slip unnoticed along the corridor, making his way to your daughter's compartment?" The question lingered in the air, pressing against the silence. Halliday's face was shadowed with doubt. "The Count de Leroux is also, if I recall correctly, tall and dark." "Precisely," Poor said softly. "And your daughter seemed anxious, did she not? Distressed even. And yet she never uttered a word about her true intentions." Halliday's hands curled into fists on the desk. "I was so sure, so certain, that Rupert had something to do with this. But now," he trailed off, staring at the letter as though it had rewritten the very foundation of his beliefs. Poor leaned back, his fingers steepled. "The pieces shift, Monsieur Halliday. What seemed so certain one moment dissolves the next. That is the nature of truth. It is never as simple as we wish it to be." A knock at the door broke the charged silence. A footman stepped in hesitantly. "Inspector Graves is here, sir." Halliday straightened. "Yes, send him in." The door opened and in stepped a stocky no-nonsense man, with a weathered face and sharp assessing eyes. The very air of Scotland Yard clung to him. He spotted Puo and let out a gruff chuckle. "Well, well," Graves said, arms crossed. "If it isn't our old friend. No hard feelings, Puo." Puo beamed at him. "None at all, mon ami. We simply have different methods, do we not?" Graves smirked. "That we do. But tell me, how are the little grey cells, eh? Still working overtime?" Puo's smile widened. "Ah, but of course. They never rest, my good inspector." "Good," Graves said with a nod. "Then let's see if they can help us untangle this mess." Inspector Graves exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. It was either the so-called Honorable Count de la Rue or a crook, no doubt about it. "We're keeping an eye on all the usual spots. If those jewels so much as glimmer in the wrong place, we'll know." Puo listened, his fingertips pressed together. A wise precaution, but perhaps. He tilted his head slightly. A day too late. Graves shot him a look, half amused, half irritated. "You always will have your little jokes, won't you, Puo? Well, I'm off. Paddington, Bristol, Weston-super-Mare, that's my beat today." He gave a brisk nod and turned toward the door. "I'll drop by later if I'm back in time." The moment the inspector left, Puo leaned back in his chair and murmured, "The good inspector believes in matter in motion. He travels, he measures footprints, he collects mud and cigarette ash. He is diligent beyond words. And yet," he let out a small sigh, "if I were to speak to him of psychology, do you know what he would do, my friend? He would smile, he would shake his head, and he would say to himself, 'Poor old Puo, he is growing senile.'" I couldn't help but smile. "And what do you intend to do then?" Puo's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Why, since we have carte blanche, I shall spend precisely 3 pennies making a telephone call to the Ritz, where our elusive Count was last seen, and after that, since my feet are slightly damp and I have sneezed twice, I shall retire to my room, warm myself with a cup of tisane over the spirit lamp, and ponder the mysteries of the human mind." I left him to his musings, but when I saw him again the next morning, he was seated at the breakfast table, perfectly at ease, buttering his toast with great care. I dropped into the chair opposite him, barely able to contain my eagerness. "Well?" I asked. "What has happened?" Without looking up, Puo replied smoothly, "Nothing." I stared at him. He dabbed at his mouth with a napkin. "Ah, but nothing is something, mon ami. The Count has disappeared." I sat up straight. "He fled." Puo nodded. "He left the Ritz the day before yesterday." My mind raced. That was the day of the murder. Precisement. I slammed my hand against the table. "Then that settles it. Rupert Carrington is cleared. If the Count vanished on the day of the murder." Puo shook his head gently. "You go too fast, my friend." I frowned. "Then he must be followed, arrested. The man had every reason to kill her. $100,000 worth of jewels is motive enough for anyone." Puo, however, only smiled that infuriatingly knowing smile of his. "Ah, but why kill her?" I blinked. "What? Why kill her?" he repeated patiently. "When he could have simply stolen the jewels, she would never have prosecuted."
"Why not?"
Puo leaned forward slightly, his voice dipping into that quiet hypnotic tone of his. "Because, mon ami, she was a woman, and once she loved this man. Do you not see? She would have suffered her loss in silence rather than expose him, and the Count, who is an exceptionally skilled manipulator, were the women concerned, would have known that perfectly well." A chill ran down my spine. Then if Rupert Carrington killed her, why take the jewels? That would only incriminate him further. Puo's eyes gleamed, as a blind perhaps, or to shift suspicion elsewhere. "The true question is not who took the jewels, but why blood had to be spilled at all." I swallowed hard, realizing that we were still tangled in the web of something far more sinister than simple theft. And once again, Puo was 10 steps ahead, already deciphering the unseen threads that bound murderer and victim together. There was a sharp, confident knock at the door. Puo smiled faintly. "Ah, I recognize that knock. Our good inspector is here." The door swung open, and Inspector Graves strode in, his face beaming with satisfaction. "Morning, Puo," he greeted cheerfully, shaking off the fatigue of a long night's work. "Only just got back, but I've done some fine work." "And you?" Puo, ever composed, folded his hands neatly. "Me? I have arranged my ideas." Graves chuckled heartily. then leaned toward me with a smirk. "The old chap is getting on in years, eh?" he muttered under his breath before turning back to Puo. "That won't do for us young folk. Now then, do you want to hear what I've uncovered?" Puo raised a hand, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Allow me to make a guess. You have found the murder weapon, no doubt a knife, discarded by the railway tracks between Weston and Taunton. And let me see, you have also spoken to the newspaper boy who interacted with Mrs. Carrington at Weston." Graves' jaw fell open. He stared at Puo as if he had performed sorcery. "How the devil did you know that?" Puo merely smiled. "Ah, you acknowledge, then, the power of my little grey cells." Graves huffed, regaining his composure. "Well, if you must know, she did indeed speak to the paper boy. And not only that, she gave him a tip. Not just a shilling, mind you, but half a crown." I saw the satisfaction flicker in Puo's eyes. "Half a crown." Graves nodded. "Americans rich and extravagant." Naturally the boy remembered her. He described everything. She inhaled deeply as she approached him, bought 2 magazines, and made a comment about one in particular. "That'll match me," she said, because the cover had a picture of a girl in blue. The lad's memory was sharp. "And the knife?" Puo asked, his voice like silk. "Exactly where I expected it to be. Given the doctor's evidence, the crime had to have been committed before Taunton. I figured the murderer wouldn't hold on to the knife for long, so I walked the tracks, searching, and there it was, tossed carelessly by the side of the line. I leaned in, intrigued. And the suspect? Any sightings at Taunton?" Graves shook his head. "It's a big station. He probably slipped away unnoticed, and took a later train back to London. But that's not all. I found something else when I got back." Puo arched an eyebrow. "Go on." Graves' voice dropped, his expression turning serious. "The jewels are being moved." Puo didn't flinch, but I felt the tension tighten between us. "The large emerald," Graves continued. "It was pawned last night." I felt a chill. "By whom?" Graves smirked. "Ah, now that's the interesting part. It was one of our regulars, a known thief, a short man by the name of Red Nary." Puo barely blinked. "Short, yes, I expected as much." Graves squinted at him. "You never cease to surprise me, Puo." He folded his arms. "Red Nary is as sharp as they come, a professional jewel thief, not one to hesitate at murder either. Normally he works with a woman, Gracie Kidd, but she's nowhere in sight this time. Maybe she's already smuggled the rest of the loot off to Holland." I exhaled sharply. "So you've arrested Nary?" "Oh, sure thing," Graves said with a nod. "But let's be clear, the real target is still out there. Nary may have moved the jewels, but he wasn't the mastermind. The real brains behind this operation was the man who rode in that train compartment with Mrs. Carrington." Puo drummed his fingers on the table. "Yes, the one who planned it all." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And the one who knew murder was the only way." A heavy silence fell over the room. The chase wasn't over, not by a long shot. The true culprit was still at large, and the game was only just beginning. "But Nary won't squeal on a pal," I muttered, watching Puo's eyes narrow, a sharp, unreadable glint flashing in their depths. A quiet, almost dangerous satisfaction flickered across his face as he folded his hands. "I think," he said gently, "that I can find Nary's pal for you." Inspector Graves eyed him warily. "One of your little ideas, eh?" he muttered, studying Puo with suspicion. "It's damn near wonderful how you manage to deliver the goods sometimes, considering your age and all," he smirked. "Devil's own luck, I suppose." "Perhaps," murmured Puo, his voice distant, almost amused. He turned to me, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculately pressed suit. "Hastings, my hat and the brush, if you please. One must maintain one's dignity, even in the pursuit of murderers." Outside, the sky had darkened, rain drizzling down in slow rhythmic drops. Puo, unbothered, hailed the first taxi we saw, and instructed the driver curtly, "Park Lane." We arrived at Halliday's grand house, its facade dark and brooding under the stormy sky. Puo moved with an unnerving ease, slipping out of the taxi, paying the fare without hesitation, and striding to the door with the confidence of a man who already knew how this would end. The footman who answered the bell barely had time to blink before Puo murmured a request in his ear, so softly I couldn't make it out. But it had the desired effect. We were swiftly led upstairs higher and higher, until we reached a small, meticulously neat bedroom at the top of the house. Poirot's gaze swept the room, absorbing every detail in a glance. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he knelt in front of a small black trunk, his fingers ghosting over the travel-worn labels stuck to its surface. From his pocket he produced a thin twist of wire, rolling it between his fingers with an air of absolute calm. "Ask Mr. Halliday if he would be so kind as to join us here," he said over his shoulder to the footman. As the man disappeared, Poirot set to work. The wire slipped into the lock, his hands moving with the finesse of a surgeon. A faint click, the lid creaked open. Without hesitation he plunged his hands inside, rummaging with quiet intensity, pulling garments free and tossing them onto the floor in a flurry of fabric. A heavy step on the stairs, a shadow in the doorway. "What in hell are you doing here?" The voice was sharp, furious. Halliday stood, his face flushed with outrage. Poirot did not look up. With an air of triumph, he withdrew something from the trunk, a coat and skirt of brilliant blue, and a small pristine wrap of white fox fur. He turned it over in his hands, then finally, lifted his gaze to meet Halliday's. "I was merely looking," he said, "for this." Behind us a gasp. I turned sharply. Jane Mason, the maid, had entered, her face pale as death. "What are you doing with my trunk?" she demanded, voice shaking. Poirot smiled almost kindly. "Hastings, if you would be so good as to shut the door." I did as he asked, stepping back, standing firm against it. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward with an unspoken finality. Poirot's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Now then, Mr. Halliday, allow me to introduce you to Gracie Kidd, otherwise known as Jane Mason, who will, I dare say, soon be rejoining her accomplice, Red Nary, under the kind escort of Inspector Graves." A stunned silence. Gracie's face twisted, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. She took a step back, then another, her fingers twitching at her sides as if calculating a way out. Poirot merely waved a hand, as though brushing away a minor inconvenience. It was all quite simple, really. He reached for a piece of toast, helping himself to more caviar, utterly unruffled. The maid's insistence on what her mistress was wearing first struck me as curious. Why was she so anxious to direct our attention to that? He took a bite, speaking around it, unbothered. We only had the maid's word about the mysterious man in the carriage at Bristol, but the doctor's evidence suggested Mrs. Carrington could have been murdered before reaching Bristol. If that were true, the maid had to be an accomplice. He gestured toward the blue coat, the fox fur, and if she was an accomplice, she needed to ensure someone else, anyone else, could testify to her story. The realization hit me like a blow. "The clothes," I breathed. "She staged the entire thing." Poirot inclined his head. "Precisely, a bright blue coat, a striking fur, these things stick in the mind. A maid has great influence over what her mistress wears, after all. If after Bristol, anyone saw a woman in these garments, they would swear they had seen Mrs. Carrington alive." I exhaled sharply. "Then, the real murder happened earlier. Between London and Bristol, most likely." Poirot agreed. "A tunnel, I imagine, provided the perfect cover. A dose of chloroform, a quick, efficient stab. The body was rolled beneath the seat. The maid took her place. I could picture it now, the deception unfolding, step by step. At Weston she made sure to be noticed." Poirot continued. "She spoke to the newspaper boy, gave him an extravagant tip, ensured he remembered her, even remarked upon the color of her dress. After leaving Weston, she threw the knife from the window, marking the scene of the crime. Then perhaps at Taunton, she changed, either into another set of clothes, or simply concealed them beneath a mackintosh." I stared at Gracie, who had gone deathly still. Poirot's voice was softer now, but no less final. "A clever trick, mademoiselle. But alas, not quite clever enough." Outside, the rain lashed against the windows, a slow, relentless drumbeat. The end had come. She left the train quietly, slipping into the crowd, as if she were just another traveler, nothing out of the ordinary. No hurried steps, no nervous glances. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed every step. By the time she reached Bristol, her accomplice had already done his part, depositing the luggage in the cloakroom, handing over the ticket, and vanishing into the night. He would be back in London before anyone even knew to look for him. She, on the other hand, had a role to play. On the platform, she made sure to be noticed, lingering just long enough, exchanging polite words with a porter, fumbling briefly with her purse, subtle gestures, ensuring she existed in the memory of those around her. Then, without fuss, she left for a small hotel, checking in for the night, under an assumed name. The next morning, she boarded the first train back to London, her alibi now woven seamlessly into reality. By the time we retraced her steps, the truth was undeniable. Every deduction I had made was falling perfectly into place. My informant confirmed that a well-known jewel smuggler had been moving the stolen gems, and I knew one thing for certain. Whoever was behind this was nothing like the mysterious figure Jane Mason had described. Lies carefully planted to mislead, and when I heard that the fence was none other than Red Nari, the man who always worked with Gracie Kidd, I knew exactly where to find her. As for the Count, the more I considered it, the more I was convinced he had nothing to do with the murder. Oh, he was a crook, no doubt about that, but he was too clever, too self-preserving to risk something as reckless as killing. Murder was not in his playbook. Halliday exhaled, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "Poor," he said, his voice measured but laced with genuine admiration. "I owe you more than just a debt. The check I'll write after lunch won't even come close to settling it." Poor merely smiled, modest as ever, and murmured to me in that quiet, knowing tone, "Let the good inspector take the credit. Officially he's caught his Gracie Kidd." He gave a slight satisfied nod, but as the Americans say, "I believe I have got his goat." Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference, oblivious to the secrets that had just unraveled in its midst. Thank you very much for listening to this story narrated by Dr. Ramon. Don't forget to subscribe to the Curious Case channel, and be sure to leave a comment.